Hello, welcome to our panel after lunch on the Saturday. This panel is called Cases of the Mediterranean. I'm Simone Pinet, I'm a professor of Spanish, and I'll be moderating this panel. Our first speaker will be Patrick Kozey. Patrick is a doctoral student in Spanish here at Cornell. He's working on a dissertation on poetic agency in Troubadours poetry, going in and out of Castile in particular. And he will be speaking to us on Southern Troubadours, medieval Iberian lyric, and the Mediterranean.
Hello everyone, and thanks so much for coming, not just to this panel, to everybody who's been here all weekend. What did you do again? All right, I'll just begin. In my presentation today, I'd like to think through what it means to view the lyric of the Troubadours as Southern, and more broadly, what examining the phenomena of troubadour lyric from the perspective of Mediterranean studies might have to offer. As a Hispano-medievalist, to employ the densest possible term, I look at the troubadours from an Iberian perspective, but each of these perspectives I've mentioned amounts to choosing a different center. Standing in each one offers an alternate view in which some things are clearer and others less so. But ultimately, no single one of these views offers a complete account of a phenomenon like troubadour lyric, which crosses so many linguistic and geographical boundaries, and which forms such an important part in the history of so many national literatures. My goal today is not to argue for one perspective over another, but rather to ask what becomes clearer and what is rendered more opaque based on the perspective we choose. Specifically, I'm curious what a broader perspective, like that of the medieval Mediterranean, reveals about the relationship of the troubadours with Spanish literary history. So, what do I mean when I say troubadour lyric? The texts that come down to us from the troubadours have been filtered through several layers from the context of their original production, performance, and reception. Preserved in around 30 chansonniers, or songbooks, these texts have been offered up as an origin, with all the problems that word entails, for vernacular poetic production in Europe. As mentioned, though, these were songs, now in textual form, separated from the music which would have accompanied their sung performance. They were preserved as they spread from what is today southern France into the north of Spain and northern Italy, in particular where much of that work of preservation was undertaken. Those doing the composing, the troubadours themselves, and the performance, sometimes called joglage, ranged from kings to barons or less important, less powerful lords, all the way down to professional singers or poets, who left behind little documentary evidence outside of their own artistic output. The period I'll be discussing is roughly from 1100 to 1300, and by the time these songs were transmuted into text, the tradition itself had expanded geographically, while the original context that allowed it to flourish changed until it ultimately disappeared. That context is key to my own analysis of these songs, or lyric, as I will also call them. Their status as poetry is a bit anachronistic. Internal to the songs themselves, they were often referred to by their genre, canso for the often amorous songs, which are the best known, or serventes for the politically motivated satire, which were often contrafacta, meaning set to the rhyme scheme or melody of a previous song. This body of texts represents a courtly lyric tradition, and the space of the court has, as I see it, two functions that allowed troubadour lyric to flourish. In an admittedly corny Latin pun on which I have been working, I describe the court as both locus amenus, or a place of pleasure, and locus administrationis, or a place of administration. The first of those is a real term, the second one is one that I have made up. Each of those roles helped to constitute the other, as the resources dedicated to maintaining the idea of the court as a space of refined pleasure depended in large part on that same court's role as a center for administration and a site of power. And as a site of power, the The construction and external presentation of a self through proper behavior or comportment and proper enjoyment of certain pleasures became all the more important for someone at court. Now, onto the range of perspectives that I mentioned earlier. I'll start with my own, which is the Iberian vantage point. The lyric of the Troubadours can be seen as having a dual relationship with the Iberian Peninsula, both coming from it and returning to it from multiple directions. With the former, I mean the argument that Arabic panegyric poetry of the courts of Al-Andalus served as an aspirational example for those who spent time in the peninsula as crusaders in the 11th and 12th centuries. And there were also reasons for northerners to pass through cities like Zaragoza on their way to Santiago de Compostela, for example. Guillaume de Poitiers, the 7th Count of Poitiers and 9th Duke of Aquitaine, made those journeys and is cited as the first troubadour. Guillaume, other than for his 11 songs, might be familiar as Eleanor of Aquitaine's grandfather. His songs themselves represent the sudden presence, seemingly without antecedents, of a sophisticated lyric system in the vernacular, Occitan in this case, which would continue to be the standard language for troubadour songs, no matter where they move geographically. There's been much debate over what thematic and technical elements can be traced to Latin or Arabic sources. Ovid is often cited, particularly by those who would like to deny an Arabic role in this key piece of medieval literary history, but it is certainly the case that this tradition draws on Latin. Maria Rosa Menocal helped spur a revival of interest in that Arabic theory of origin for troubadour lyric with her first book in 1987, and obviously Professor Reynoso has spoken about that more recently, the issue of rhyme. Suffice it to say, without fully entering into the polemic, today most scholars will grant some role to Arabic poetry from the Iberian Peninsula in the history of the development of the first vernacular lyric composed in Europe. The other dimension of the Iberian connection to the troubadours is the journey of that lyric back to the Iberian Peninsula. This takes place on multiple paths. There are Iberian troubadours, like Guillaume de Bergueda, a Catalan nobleman, and the force behind some particularly vulgar satirical lyric that is the topic of my investigation elsewhere, which helped spread the tradition further south. Other troubadours also spent time in the court of the King of Castile. By the 13th century, as the fortunes of Occitan-speaking courts in southern France waned, that movement intensified. Giraud Riquier, the so-called last troubadour, who's famous for compiling an anthology of his own work, which up until then had not happened, made his way to the court of Alfonso X, El Sabio, the Wise, where he wrote a series of verses and then a feigned response from Alfonso on the proper role of a troubadour at court, and what distinguished his own high art from the low forms of jugleria with which he was competing for patronage. Alfonso himself, while employing a different language, Galician Portuguese, that had attained a currency in Iberia for courtly lyric, oversaw the compilation of richly illuminated collections of songs that placed the Virgin Mary as the donna, or lady, at the center of courtly love lyric. Of course, as with origins of troubadour lyric in general, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, as that collection is called, draws on a number of sources, including traditions of Marian literature, but the role of the troubadours is evident. Alfonso calls himself a troubadour for the Virgin, and drapes himself in a mantle of cultural prestige, similar to the move he makes in commissioning his law codes, the Siete Partidas, which helped to establish Castilian as a literary and legal language for the 13th century. The troubadours also critically traveled to courts in Italy. As I mentioned before, much of what survives does so thanks to the compilation of songbooks in northern Italy. They made their way further south as well, serving as a model for Frederick II and for production in Sicily, around the same time that Alfonso's Cantigas were being compiled. Later, when those songs had been converted into textual artifacts, Dante and Petrarch would encounter them and imagine the power they once held over their audiences. The vidas, a kind of brief life that often accompanied these songs, which would frequently take the form of a kind of deflated version of poetry, serving as biography, can help us understand how Dante decided to include multiple troubadours in his Comedia. He places Bertrand de Born, an author of political Cervantes, in hell, carrying his own head in his hands for the schismatic role that his songs played in moving armies against one another among Christians. And Arnaud Daniel, the inventor of the sestina as a form, and a practitioner of a closed style, of the Troubadours, is placed in purgatory, and Dante allows him to speak in Occitan, in the otherwise Italian poem. Later, when poets in Spain began to take up the Italianate influence of the Petrarchan sonnet and other lyric innovations, this could be seen as yet another strand of Iberian literary history returning where it came from, though obviously changed for its journey. While this is the view with the center in Iberia, my question remains, what do perspectives from other centers look like? The title of my presentation asks what a southern troubadour might be. This, unlike Iberia or the Mediterranean, is the most subjective lens with which I'll engage, since the entirely fair question would be south of what, as we discussed earlier this morning. All troubadour literary production is southern if we place ourselves north of Languedoc, or in Germany, for instance. Bill Bardwinkle, when he's introducing troubadour poetry in the Cambridge History of French Literature, is obliged to explain why such a southern literary tradition should even be included in the canon. I think the most helpful aspect of thinking about southern troubadours is the attention it calls to the spread of Occitan lyric in such exempla of European southernness as the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily. Even at the height of troubadour production in the 12th century, there are Catalan troubadours, as I mentioned above, that frequently go ignored in the larger study of the lyric corpus, as well perhaps for their southernness in terms of their location vis-a-vis France. For me personally, I think the most evocative aspect of thinking about southern troubadours is the recollection of this lyric's Arabic inheritance. Iberia, however, is certainly not at the center of the Mediterranean, into that perspective. In fact, it's on the periphery, just as it was in the Umayyad Caliphate, which allowed for its continued importance in that world as that Islamic empire split apart. While the period that Fernand Braudel, for instance, focuses on in his work on the Mediterranean, of Felipe II in the 16th century, places Spain more or less at the heart of that sea, this was not the case from 1100 to 1300. So what does the perspective of Mediterranean studies have to offer us then regarding the phenomena of the troubadours? I'll quote a pair of scholars focused on medieval Mediterranean literary history as to what the discipline means for them. Sharon Kinoshita writes that, quote, Mediterranean studies is less a way of defining or delimiting a geographic space than a heuristic device for remapping traditional disciplinary divides. Most obviously, it displaces the nation as the default category of analysis, end quote. She also writes that, quote, Hispano-medievalists, too long marginalized in medieval studies, have taken the lead in challenging the segregation of literatures into distinct literary traditions. So, thanks to her for that recognition of the field. Carla Millet, in an article that echoes her book, European Modernity and the Arab Mediterranean, asks how literary historians ought to go about practicing philology. That discipline, she points out, came into being in the 19th century alongside, while also helping to constitute, ideas of nationalism that justified the study of medieval literature only insofar as it provided an origin point for a national literature, be it Spanish, Italian, or French. She then writes that, quote, medieval literary historians have known for some time that we must get out of the habit of thinking in terms of the national literatures that would emerge centuries after the text we study were written. None of this seems too problematic to me. Indeed, it meshes quite well with what I've already brought up, this kind of transnational, anti-national perspective, whatever you'd like to call it, certainly helps provide us with new points of comparison. In the same article that I mentioned before, Kinoshita trying to spell out what it would mean to study medieval Mediterranean literature as a category from her own vantage point in the field of French literature, points to the possibility of finding new texts to hold up next to already familiar ones. In her reading, she looks at a Turkish text from a date similar to various chansons de gestes and says that it might hold promise. In the case of the troubadours, this would enable us to read Guillaume de Poitiers' poetry alongside Arabic poetry from Al-Andalus without worrying so much about claims of direct influence or transmission. Yet, Kinoshita also provides some other suggestions about the benefit of Mediterraneanizing, that's a word she uses, one's perspective, that seem much more tied to her own feel of French than they do to Spanish literary studies. For her, attaching French medieval literary history to the Mediterranean provides a much broader field in which to work. I think it's admirable in its apparent motivation, seeking to open up a field one views as too closed off is the kind of intellectual pendulum swing that happens periodically, and it's an important part of the renovation of a discipline. What I wonder, however, is whether taking one's eye off the ball, so to speak, might not mean that other things go unnoticed. Let me return to my dual directional analogy for Iberia's relationship with troubadour lyric as an example. An overarching Mediterranean approach would certainly help us understand the movement from the Iberian Peninsula, but I think it might miss the movements back to Iberia. After all, why bother tracing the movement back to Spain from Italy if not because of a distinctly Iberian perspective? For the new connections on offer then, I wonder if that larger scale perspective might not lead to misconnections as well. I don't wish to seem as though I'm objecting to any individual approach here outright, or offering my own version of Giraud Riquier's self-justifying verses to Alphonse X, as sure a sign as any that the tradition one is defending is already on its way out. I've laid out what I see as the benefits of these alternate perspectives. I do worry, though, about any approach that, when pushed to its extreme, might suggest that primarily focusing on something too specialized is backward-looking. The idea of the Mediterranean as a larger category within which different fields of study might sit or overlap seems encouraging. But subsuming those fields under one umbrella and then rendering them subordinate does not. To be explicit, I'm engaging in a defense of my perspective as a valid one, but only as that, one of many valid perspectives. My objection is not to the use of a different lens or focus, it is to the assumption that, rather than a particular approach having things it is good or bad at analyzing, I object to declaring a particular methodology good or bad in an ethical sense. Today, we are at a conference organized under the umbrella of the Department of Romance Studies. Between us, the members of this department possess a diversity of perspectives and a range of centers from which we see things very differently. There's nothing negative per se about that kind of situation, and rather than moral superiority for comparatists and inferiority for focused specialists, I'd like to emphasize the obvious fact that each type of scholarship requires the other to advance itself. I think something that Kinoshita mentions at the end of her article might offer some help, and that is collaboration. The mixing of perspectives from different scholars with different areas of interest, overlapping or otherwise, is an imperfect solution, but a possible one. If the Mediterranean is not one sea, but many, as is so often said, a space that across millennia is best understood as a tapestry of interwoven micro-histories coming together to form the macro image, then it seems like a fitting analogy for what we are doing here this weekend, for this conference and its ideas of South, and for this panel and its perspectives across time on different pockets of the same Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.